rapidly increasing in popularity, and personally, I've had the best results with it. If I'm working with a model in another format, I will most often re-export to GLTF using Blender. It has solved many issues for me. GLTF comes in two versions, .gltf and .glb. GLB is the binary version. It's smaller and recommended for most cases. Godot also supports .blend files, which means if you're working in Blender, you can save your Blender file directly into your Godot project and it will import correctly. Behind the scenes, Godot is actually calling Blender to export to GLTF, which means that you have to have Blender installed for .blend files to work. Now, for this part, I'll be using some assets from the amazing K-Kid and Kenny. I've made a few tweaks and bundled together just the ones that I use if you want to try some of these things out on the exact same assets. Or if you want the full pack, definitely check out the original creators. Links for both in the description. So here I have a chest with some coins in it. The chest is made up of a GLTF file containing the model and a separate PNG texture. So let's create a models folder in Godot, select it and drag in our chest. From here we can drag it into our scene and voila, a chest. The texture isn't applied, but we'll fix that in a second. Now a very important thing to note here is that next to the model is this scene icon. Often a 3D asset will contain more than a single mesh. It might have an entire hierarchy of objects. To make this easy for us to manage, Godot treats a GLTF file like a Godot scene. And we can go ahead and open it like any other scene. It's going to tell us that this scene belongs to our GLTF file, so we can't modify it. That should be done with your modeling program. But we can open it and see what's in here by pressing open anyway. And here we can see all of the nodes that now make up this asset in Godot. Even if you import a GLTF file with just a single mesh in it, Godot will put it under a root node and create a scene for it. Now sometimes our assets might import without issue, but oftentimes we need to make adjustments. So let's select the GLTF and go to our import window. Here are a bunch of settings, most of which you can ignore for now. But one you might need right away is root scale. This allows us to adjust the scale of the imported model. So in this case, I think 1 is fine. While we can adjust many things in the import window, a lot of the really important import settings are actually under advanced. We can click the advanced button or simply double-click the file, and this will open up the advanced import settings. Don't be scared by the fact that it's called advanced. This window simply gives you much more control over the different parts of your model. Here we can see the nodes making up the scene, and if we select one, we can set import settings for just that node. Say we didn't want to import the chest lid, well then we could simply hit skip import for just that node. And if we select the scene at the top, we get the standard import settings. We can also go under materials to see all of the materials that got imported. And the cool thing is that we can override any of the imported materials with our own. So let's create a material for this chest. I'll right click, create new, resource, and I'll search for standard material. Here's the standard material 3D. I'll name it matte chest. And now in the advanced import settings, we can select the default material, go under use external and enable that, and point to the material that we just created. Which means that if we re-import, we can now go to our material, and any changes we make here will apply to our chest. And to add our texture, we simply drag it into the albedo texture slot. And this is probably a good time to talk a bit about the standard material. The standard material is a very powerful and also flexible PBR material that can be used for anything from wood to metals, vegetation, and emissive surfaces. It can even act as a simple toon shader by changing the diffuse and specular modes to toon. The standard material really deserves an entire video in its own right, because it has so many properties that you can adjust to get the look you're going for. And of course we can use textures or maps to set these as well. But to get started, here's a quick overview of the most common ones. Albedo, the base color of your material. If you use an albedo texture to set this, it can use both the RG and B channels to define color. You can also use the alpha channel to define transparency if you mark the material as transparent. Metallic, how reflective is the surface? This is a value that goes from 0 to 1, where 1 is completely reflective. However, internally, even at 0, the material reflects a tiny bit, just like in real life. A metallic map requires only one channel. Note that once in a while you might run into something called a specular map. This is an alternative to the metallic workflow that Godot uses and is not supported. Roughness. How smooth or rough is the surface? A material with a low roughness value results in sharp reflections. As the roughness increases, the light becomes more scattered and the reflections start to get fuzzy. A roughness map also only requires one channel. Some assets provide a smoothness map instead. This is the same as roughness but inverted. In this case, I would recommend inverting it in an image editor before importing to Godot. Normal. Here you can add a normal map to simulate depth. It changes the way light interacts with the surface to display smaller shape details. However, the mesh is not actually affected by a normal map. Because of this, the effectiveness will vary depending on the viewing angle. A normal map uses the RGB channels. Be aware that Godot uses normal maps in OpenGL style. Some normal maps that are created for DirectX will appear inverted. You can go to the import window and select normal map invert Y. This will convert it from one style to the other. Ambient occlusion. Here you can add an AO map that affects how much ambient light reaches the surface. In other words, it can darken the parts of your model where light has a hard time reaching. And it uses one channel. Emission. Does the surface emit light? We can set this manually or use an emission map. But this is more pertaining to lighting, so we'll move on. There are of course many other types of maps like height or refraction, but these are for more advanced use cases, so we won't go into them here. At this point you might be thinking, that's a lot of textures for just one model. And many games will definitely only need a fraction of them. But if your game needs them all, it can be a challenge to fit that many textures into the game. Because of this, it is common to use an ORM texture and material. Remember that ambient occlusion, roughness, and metallic textures only require one channel each. This means that in practice they can be combined into an ORM texture, where each map occupies either the red, green, or blue channel. Godot fully supports this workflow with a version of the standard material called ORM Material 3D, which can be combined with regular standard materials without issue. And on the subject of materials, for some workflows, the 3D artist will set up all the material properties in the 3D software. In this case, the textures will often be packaged with the model file. This is called packed or embedded textures. Here, for example, I have a barrel, which just consists of a GLTF. The material and texture has already been set up in Blender and packed into the file. So if I import it, Godot will extract the textures and place them next to the GLTF. And the model is ready to use. We can always go under the import settings and at the bottom under embedded image handling, choose what happens to the textures. As you can see, this is set to extract by default, and so it appears next to the model. Double click the barrel, go under actions. There's an option here to extract materials. So I'm just gonna extract them in the same place. And now we can configure the material. This is useful because not all materials in your 3D program will transfer perfectly into Godot materials, in which case you might want to adjust them here. Alright, so our test is imported and looking great, but how do we actually start using it in our game? Now if we play the game, I can run right through it, so we'd at least want to add some kind of collision. And what I see a lot of people do is go here to Open Scene and choose New Inherited. This creates an inherited scene based on the GLTF file. What this means is that we can add new nodes to the scene and even override some properties, but we can't modify the original hierarchy, which turns yellow to indicate this. So we could add a node here, we can add a script, make some changes, and when we're satisfied, save it as a new scene that we can use in our game. And this works, but there are a few problems. First of all, using inherited scenes quickly gets very confusing. What's part of the original asset and what's not? Also, it breaks very easily. If I make a change to the asset and it gets re-imported, it can be hard to predict what happens to the inherited scene, and your changes might get removed. And doing it this way means that we are basing our game functionality on a graphics asset. This is generally a no-go, especially in more complicated scenarios. In fact, most of the time we're doing the exact opposite. We build functionality without fancy visuals, and then bring in those visuals as we'd like.